that would be fantastic. As our lunchtime entertainment, we have a chat with PIIE President Adam Posen. I'm pleased to be moderating it. I have lots of good questions for Adam.
Yes, you do.
In addition to being PIIE President and a driving force behind this project, Adam was also, for those of you who don't know, he was a member of the UK Monetary Policy Committee from 2009 through 2012. So, we've been kind of very fortunate to have a few former central bankers on this program, but Adam is one of those groups, so I think he is particularly well equipped to speak to these questions. So Adam.
Karen.
Okay.
Okay.
So I want to start you with kind of backward-looking questions about what happened in the early 2020s. And the one I'm going to start with was, you were just one of a handful of economists who were warning about high inflation in early 2021. I remember this so well because we had a global economic prospects event in April 2021, and I think you said to me, I was speaking, but I think you said to me, oh, can I just say a few words before we get started? And sure enough, Adam gets up there, and he starts talking about how he thinks that the economy is at risk of seeing really high inflation because of the aggressive stance of policy and other factors. And I showed before in my presentation, I showed you the median Wall Street Journal private forecaster forecast. But I've also looked at the distribution. You can get the distribution off their website, and even if you look across the distribution, there were a couple people up there saying inflation might get as high as 3%, but really most of them just didn't see this coming. But you did. So what is it? What spidey sense did you have? Like, what were you looking at? What were you thinking about when you made this call?
I'm very grateful, Karen, you remember that. And all of us at Peterson are very fortunate that for now several years you have been running our semi-annual forecast, and we benefit greatly from that. I think what I saw, what it was worth in 2021, which is partly political economy informed and partly cross-nationally informed, was the fact that fiscal swings actually matter a lot. And everything you said about in your presentation about how could you know and given the legacy of the essentially error of insufficient fiscal response in 2008, 9, 10, that was baked in. And the cross-national part, I would say, is from work I and others did, including Kenneth Kuttner, on Japanese fiscal policy in the 90s and early 2000s, was when uncertainty is high, when monetary policy is limited in how far it can go, fiscal policy tends to be even more effective in terms of impact multiplier. But I guess the third thing, and this is one of the reasons I'm excited about the papers that genuinely excited about the papers that you and David pulled together, is there is this sense, I think, that got lost, that this, notwithstanding what Justin showed about the beverage curve, that this was a very big shock in terms of labor markets in the US and in terms of energy markets in Europe, UK, and abroad. And you would think, oh, those are very different shocks. But in a sense, I think the common graphs, and this is why some of the work Joe and Asher did breaking down the inflation matters, I think the common graphs kind of hid the fact that that it really was a supply shock, not so much a demand shock on the labor market side. And so it so happened you had this very large energy supply shock in Europe, and you had this very large labor supply shock in the US, and they both moved in the same direction. But that people, I think, were still thinking about it as very much a demand shock in the US. I don't think and again, I don't want to claim perfect foresight by any means or criticize those who didn't see it, but I think there was a reluctance to realize that that was the right way to think about it. And so you had this combination of very large fiscal that from a political economy historical sense I saw coming. And obviously it wasn't just me, Jason Furman, Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard, others affiliated at the time with the Peterson Institute also talked about that. But also just that this was a big deal. And so the idea that, as much as I love central bankers, going to some things that Patrick and Steve and talked about and others have spoken about, and some of the stuff Joanne was talking about, putting a huge amount of faith in central bank anchored expectations was overdoing it. And so that was the other thing I would say. So if you go back and you look at that period, and again, not to talk about colleagues in a bad way, but if you look, some of the things that were being said by some of the people I mentioned were essentially, if you look at it in real time, they were essentially saying the weight on the inflation anchor was 0. And then the people who were overly calm basically said the weight on the inflation anchor is 100%. And I can't remember if I explicitly said it in that presentation you mentioned, but I did try to say to various people, probably somewhere in between. Probably the Fed's credibility didn't go to 0, but it's also probably the Fed's credibility is not entirely in this situation 100% what it was. And so anyway, so that's how I ended up.
So can I poke more about this? So you made a lot of logical arguments here. You're using kind of good economic theory. You were at the Bank of England in what was also a time of great uncertainty. I'm curious, people have, the data and also the models. So I'm curious, so Peterson is now taking a big interest in data and supporting the integrity of our, our statistical systems around the world. I'm curious about, I guess, 2 things as a member of the committee. One is the question about, if you were sending your staff out to kind of go look for indications that your priors were right. Well, what would you point them to? But that's part A. Part B, which is kind of a different question, is about models. Models are a result of historical relationships that we see in the data. And I'm curious about kind of where you stand in the debate over, over reliance on models.
Yeah, well, as I believe it was Alan Blinder famously said, you can complain about forecasts, but I'm paraphrasing Alan, so forgive me if I get it wrong. You can complain about forecasts, but if you don't have any forecast or any model, the discussion's completely undisciplined. I think you said something about that in one of your little books of lectures on central banking. And I am, as people may know, I am at the very low end of econometric skill among people in this room. But the idea that you have to have some discipline on what you're saying and sort of picking up on things Patrick was saying or what's implicit in what you were saying, Karen, you have to have in your head, there's an output gap piece, there's a what are the shocks piece, there's a fiscal policy piece, there's a financial structures piece, and then there is, as Patrick kept saying, there's a transmission issue. There's how do you get it, and that gets into monetary credibility and other things.
So what you're saying, we certainly don't need to throw the framework out. We don't need to throw the Phillips curve out.
Yeah.
But we need to put
I think
these relationships in context.
I think we do need to be more humble and aware that the relative importance of these factors is more subject to change over time or is more regime dependent, if you want to use that language. And that's one of the reasons I like Joe and Steve's paper and other stuff Joe has done, including with Asher on the Phillips curve, that if you're in a long time low inflation environment, it behaves one way, and then we all talk about a kink. And in a higher inflation environment, it behaves another way. Or putting it differently, we're not always on the cusp of the 70s. If you think we're in the 90s or the early 2000s, you think it behaves one way. And if you think we're on the cusp of the 70s, it behaves another way. And so that gets to your point about what would be the things you would be looking at. Is you want to get the beige book, or at the Bank of England, what are called the agents reports, from discussions with actual businesses, small businesses, investors, people in the real world of what's going on. And so right now, Governor Chris Waller just issued a statement ahead of the recent data in which he was saying he's hearing a lot about layoffs. And then it turned out we got the latest JOLTS data seems to say a lot of layoffs. Now, I don't think Governor Waller's actually right. I think the labor market is actually in pretty solid shape. But I do think that's the right kind of exercise. That's the right way to be thinking about this. Is the other point I would make, and I'm sorry if this is going on too long, I would stress that the mental frames and errors are very different, in my view, for the 2008 to 10 or 11 crisis, for the COVID response, and for today.
And for today, yeah.
And again, I think you have to be open-minded about that. So in 2008-9, and credit to Bernanke and Mervyn King and others who were involved at the time, in 2009, intellectually, there was very little question. This was something of a rerun of the 30s. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was a financial system shock amplifying a negative shock, and that the question was, could monetary policy do anything to arrest this while you're trying to clean up the financial system? And the uncertainty of information, in my view, and I think was subsequently proved right, was the uncertainty about the specifics of, I joked very bitterly during the crisis that at the Bank of England, even though I wasn't on the financial supervision stability side, every day you'd open a new desk drawer and Barclays or somebody had stuffed in there another couple billion of bad loans. And the same thing was happening here. I see Esther George, I see others here who lived through this, and Patrick, of course. The information problem wasn't conceptual. It was about figuring out where the financial problems were. And then, again, with credit to our ever-invoked today, luckily on vacation, Joe Gagnon, who worked for Ben Bernanke and others on designing the first round of QE. It was technical problems about what was the best way to transmit policy when the financial transmission was broken down. But it wasn't conceptually hard.
Yeah.
Whereas COVID, I think I'm much more sympathetic to those who got it wrong, quote unquote, because it was conceptually hard. We hadn't seen a pandemic, thank God, in forever. And all these subtleties like Phil was talking about with the shipping, or the fact that there was ex post, again, Joe Gagnon, that you figured out that in the Korean War boom, there was this shift from durables to services, or from, what you were spending on. These were things that you had to really think hard. And so just to flag one more example, Asher Rose and I have a paper that we were doing for this conference that, for my fault, we didn't get done in time for deadline for this conference. But one of the points we start with is, again, the comparison of unemployment. And ex ante, a number of people, not just here, but including our colleagues Olivier Blanchard and Jean Pisani-Ferry, published papers saying, you know, the Europeans and Japanese probably have it right. In the US, we're going to have a problem because we're not making sure people are linked to their jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there was this whole question of subsidies or job fairs or anti-firing incentives, and that Europe, and Stan Feuger over at AEI's done some work on this, that Europe in advance said, we're going to do this because we think there's all this firm-specific, job-specific human capital, and they're just going to hire people back. And so what's the point of having that destroyed? And in the US, despite including Chair Powell and others at the Fed saying this is really important, we didn't set up anything like that because basically our system just couldn't do it in a short amount of time. But it turned out ex post, and this is what Asher and I have in development, but we'll see how the paper comes out. Turns out ex post, it looks like there was actually a lot of really good churn.
Yeah.
In the US.
It's what labor economists kind of always say.
Yeah. And I think nobody ex ante, certainly not I, saw that except possibly some very ideological people who are like, we're dynamic in the US, it must be good.
Yeah.
You know, I think ex ante, the right guess. So anyway, I think.
So would you argue that that's a positive supply shock that in addition to anchored expectations, in addition to monetary policy, gets credit for the anchored,
thank you for pushing that. You're absolutely right. And again, I think part of our argument and the point I would make, again, with this, you can make the comparative inflation graph and that misses the point. I mean, you had this huge shift in where people were employed. You had this large acceleration in productivity growth that I would argue was in large part due to this labor market. So it lasted a few years and is now petering out and the baton is being handed elsewhere. And you didn't have that in Europe or Japan.
Yeah.
And so to say, oh, they had the same inflation outcome is actually missing the point. The reasons for the inflation outcomes were very different.
Yeah. Okay. So I had more backward-looking questions, but let's go to forward-looking because, we've seen strong productivity growth in the first half of the 2020s. There is this period where you can see, productivity, the level going well above trend. I think you and Asher together have this kind of nice story about better matching. Yes, probably in the rearview mirror at this point.
Right.
And yet this year we're again seeing strong productivity growth. People think maybe this is the beginnings of AI showing up in productivity growth. So I know you are worried. I want you to talk about kind of, you've been out there saying, got to watch the risks of inflation now for a variety of reasons. Right. And I would like you to talk about that research. But let me just say, one could counter that story by saying, oh, no, we're repeating the late 1990s. We've got a big positive productivity shock. That's going to save us from inflation. So
I think,
please talk about all of that.
No, thank you, Karen. I mean, I think this is, as opposed to some other things, again, in 2008, 9, 10, there were disagreements, but I really feel like the vast majority of mainstream economists were all in one place and should have all been in one place. And there were debates about implementation issues or things, or about what information on the financial system, but broadly people were in the same place. I think right now there is, and I was talking about this with someone earlier today, and I keep talking about this, there's basically a cloud of mainstream expectations about the current impact of AI. And so, imagine, I'm going to be extra nerdy without a chart. You have a three-dimensional graph, right? You have how soon AI kicks in, how much productivity growth it does, and how much job displacement it does.
Yeah.
And you can find David Autor and Daron Acemoglu towards the origin that it's not going to have much it's not going to have much productivity growth, or it's not effective yet, and maybe there'll be job displacement. And you can have experts like Eric Jorgensen out here saying there's going to be huge productivity growth and it's already here. And Anton Kornek, one of the world's leading experts on this, just joined us here at Peterson talking about these issues. And he's still at Virginia. I mean, like Karen, a contributing part-time. But anyway, you know, you can basically create a cloud. We honestly don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. And so when I look at this, but if you're a central banker or if you're a central banker former wannabe like me who has to make forecasts, you have to make a call.
Oh.
And to me, the way I would interpret the current situation is partly there is this baton handoff that the productivity large part of the productivity growth over the last few years in the US is still the working through of this labor market churn. But now what's happening is you're starting to get the productivity growth from AI. But the twist, I would say, and I'm not alone in this, but everybody's a minority wherever they are in this cloud. I and other people would say, I think if you look at past episodes of general purpose technology, go back to Robert Gordon's work, what you often get is the surge in real income comes before the surge in labor market restructuring and other forms of productivity growth. So think of it like the radio comes in. The radio comes in 100, 120, 10 years ago, 105 years ago, and suddenly everybody's got radios. And for my grandmother, an immigrant out of the shtetl, this was an entirely different world. And the number of utils that she and her family got through the magic of the radio was enormous. But it took time before that translated into changes in consumption patterns, changes in production patterns, changes in corporate behavior. Similarly with the internet, if we think about the 90s, right? And this goes to the ever-famous, ever-rightly cited Bob Solo on It's Not in the Statistics Yet. People started playing with the internet, enjoying things, enjoying the sound of the modem going, all this stuff, playing civilization, long before corporate America and elsewhere figured out how to change their production processes and reallocate labor. So my guess, and I'll bring it back to inflation in 1 second.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
And so my guess is we're in the start of a cycle, and I can't tell you exactly how long it is, but that we're in the part of the cycle where this is a positive real supply shock, but most of it's the form of positive real income, and very little of it is the form of disinflation. It's the mirror image of what nominee Warsh or Governor Waller or others say about tariffs or migration. They say, oh, that's a one-off supply shock. It doesn't have to be nominal. And I think they've got it exactly wrong.
Okay, so tell me why you are.
Yeah, so
Please elaborate on your kind of bearish views about, I don't know if bearish is the right word.
So finishing on the productivity, thank you, is that they're right in theory that it's just as with the negative supply shock. With the positive supply shock, it's to be determined how much of that at any given moment is felt as a disinflationary force and how much of that is a real growth force. But I think when you look at technologies and the necessary processes of corporate learning and adaptation and labor market learning and adaptation, we're at the real income part and the nominal disinflation part is still to come. They're premature on that. And then by the same token, and this is something I argued in an essay in Business Week recently, and it's picked up in some stuff I've written with Peter Orszag, there is a decision-making adaptation process for businesses on when and how they pass through inflation, for migrant workers on when and how they decide to leave, when the risk is enough, and so the idea that there's a lag from when these policies changed roughly 10 months ago to when you start seeing it in the nominal inflation, I think is very logical. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Karen, about what are the things you look at.
Are you willing to put a number on inflation for this year?
I think I'm way out there. I think it's going to be close to 4% on headline CPI by the end of the year. I have had friends say to me, Adam, you could be out there enough just by saying 3.5. Yeah. And probably it would be the wiser part of valor to say that. But it's like, So I did a piece internally for community at PIE, and then Peter and I went back and forth, and we did this slightly longer piece. But basically, it's like at the end of the Maltese Falcon when Sam Spade basically says to Bridget O'Shaughnessy, you know, there are so many reasons why I can't trust you. There are so many reasons why inflation should be high at this point. We got expanding fiscal policy, and I'll very confidently make a call that fiscal policy, for reasons you and I have talked about, is going to be much looser than people have built into their forecast. You're going to have delayed but real, coming in now in 2026, inflation, first round effects, but inflation from anti-migrant tariff policies. You're going to have, frankly, going back to Joe and Steve's paper, and going back to the Volcker experience of 82 versus 85, you're going to have whatever inflation shocks take place now take place in the context of lower anchoring and credibility than they did as a result of it being a few years since 2021, 2022. So you got this whole bunch of things. And basically the alternative is, and I think you have we don't need to go into it, but I think you have a very tight, arguably very tight labor market, because again, going back to stuff Asher and I are working on, and it's not published yet, so don't take it seriously until we get it out there. But that, you know, labor force participation is still very high for prime age workers. Some of the things pushing up on unemployment, like African-American unemployment, is probably in large part attributable to anti-DEI, anti-government, reallocation of government spending against government contracting, which is heavily pro-African-American, I think for good reasons, but just empirically is that. Rising youth unemployment is a very slow rise over 3 years, partly AI, partly other COVID things, but it's not like suddenly, ooh, we had a demand deficiency and suddenly unemployment among young people spiked. So to me, the idea that we had this huge set of hiring and reallocation after COVID, that there's an overhang and that businesses are not hiring a lot at the moment, but also not firing, to me is perfectly sensible, but doesn't tell you got a weak labor market.
We only have a few minutes left.
Good.
I want to see if I have many more interesting questions for you. But do people out there have questions? If so, please come to the mic.
Challenges?
All right, then I get
Karen's
to ask mine.
Questions are more interesting to comment, so let's go back to Karen's
I want you to talk about the fiscal theory of the price level. You know, the theory that inflation is ultimately anchored by fiscal credibility rather than monetary policy alone. Do you find that, there's a lot of talk about it these days, do you find it credible?
I always had a problem with this when it was abstract. You know, whether it was Willem Bouter or Chris Sims or other brilliant people would sort of talk about it in generic terms about fiscal theory of the price level. But when you start putting it in a more concrete political economy context, that the regimes that tend to run these kinds of repeated deficits also tend to be the populist regimes that attack central bank independence, that also tend to be the ones that get concerned about resorting to financial repression. And the BIS just had I would call it nice but depressing piece about how even at current levels of debt, the Federal Reserve and other major central banks are potentially in trouble because their transmission is constrained by the swings in interest rate payments in these kinds of circumstances. You know, then the fiscal theory of the price level starts to kick in. And this is why things that you and Doug Elmendorf have written on automatic stabilizers, we had, some of you will remember, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a major joint conference on fiscal policy with the IMF here.
Yep.
And in the closing panel, it was very striking. Jason Furman and Christina Romer, 2 other former CEA chairs, both came out very strongly against discretionary fiscal policy, and you can go back and read the video, see the videos on the Peterson website.
I remember it well.
For greater automatic stabilization and fiscal rules.
Yeah.
And that was before we got to the current political situation in the US. So fiscal theory of the price level in the very academic sense, I'm not a huge fan, but fiscal theory of the price level going again to you have to be realistic about what regime you're in. And then that takes place against a context with a little bit less political, but just the fact that, as we've discussed, you and I and others on this stage many times with Peterson affiliates, you know, we're in a world where arguably R-star is going up. And to cite Summers on Hansen on secular stagnation, if you have a sustained erosion in fiscal discipline, desirable or not, that pushes up your R-star. And we're in a world where you're spending more on defense, more on demographics, more on pandering in the populist sense. And frankly, and this is something I've flagged that I think people are becoming more aware of, less capital flowing directly from East Asia, particularly China, into the US and into the West. All of these things push up on R-star. All of these things push up on the fiscal issues. And additionally, you know, let me stop there. I just see a world. Oh yeah, and then of course, as you've written about in the past, and our former colleague Jeremy Zettelmeyer has written about, if you have a sustained productivity rise, it's generally neutral for fiscal policy to a first approximation because revenues and growth go up in tandem, and the return on capital goes up roughly 1-for-1 with the return on the growth rate. So that doesn't save you from this.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. We need to break so we can get ready for the next panel. We're going to reconvene at, let's see, 1:10. But I want everyone to please join me in thanking Adam for sharing his wisdom about these issues.
Thank you.